Welcome back to another episode of Parker's Theorem. I have some visual aids this time that I printed out, but, you know how I put the faces over my heads last time? Well, I thought I would be clever and print them out so I could do it in real time, and my printer had a little problem. Alright, so, Andrew ended up looking okay. Andrew looks fine, but there was a problem with the color, and Toby looks kind of jaundiced, and, I don't even know what happened to Tom. But you know what? I don't want to waste paper or effort printing them again, so we're just gonna deal with these, and all 5 people who watch this can just enjoy how bad those look. Alright, continuing. Small trigger warning, there's a little section that talks about some suicidal ideation. It doesn't really get bad, but I'll just put that out there anyway. If you're sensitive to that, just heads up. Chapter 2. None Other Than. He is unequivocally alone. Until he isn't. Dinner that night consisted of baked beans on brown bread, because he didn't have a toaster, and a heavy textbook about particle physics and string theory. Which was a bit ironic, considering he was one of the few in all existence who could actually prove string theory was authentic and real. And yet, the words in the textbook didn't seem to register. They swam over and in his head, then fell out somewhere else, unregistered and incomprehensible. The only thing that remained seared into his mind was that face, not Dr. Osborne's face, that seemed to grin at him at every shadowed corner that he glanced into. No, it was the other thug's face, leering at him with a crazed look in his eye, one fit with rage that almost matched Peter's own resentment. Peter could barely understand what had overcome him. All he had felt was anger, and his body seemed to instinctively respond to that with violence. But it was easier to deal with, he bitterly told himself, as he rolled into bed later that night. It was easier to deal with than sadness. The rage gave him purpose, and sadness left him pathetic. Worst of all was hope, which only would bring disappointment. Every second that passed in the day was just another second that needed to be filled with mundane distraction. He barely cared what the distraction was. Studying, work, violence, walking, music, swinging, crawling, fighting, anything that could keep his eyes away from the shadows and his thoughts outside of his mind. Would he sleep tonight? What would he dream about? What would his incessant mind pick from the catalogue of the ever-ending nightmares that pressed in each corner of his mind? Would it be more aberrant terrors of a Would it be more aberrant terrors of a rusted, splintered Iron Man helmet staring at him from the shadows? Would it be the blank and unseeing expression of Aunt May, lifeless eyes gazing into him and bringing a piercing guilt into his heart like shards of glass? Would it be the curled, teasing smirk of Dr. Norman Osborn, who poked and prodded at his engulfing desire for revenge that Peter buried so deeply? Or would it be something new? Something worse? It was like a clock ticking down to its final second, finally snapping at its destined number. It always came to this. Peter folded over in his bed, seizing his pillow and pressing it against his face until his vision went pitch black. Tears spilled from his eyes and down his cheeks, and guttural noises rose from his chest, traveled through his throat until it burned and surfaced into muted cries and whimpers as he attempted to keep his misery at bay. Worst of all was the depression that yawned in his heart, aching and bellowing, growing in his stomach and gnawing into his chest, dark vines contorting and twisting through his ribcage and choking out his heart. Peter retched and finally broke into a quivering mess of tears and drool, yet nearly completely muffled and silent, bar the whimpers that were enveloped by his pillow. The darkness threatened to swallow him whole. It gnawed and throttled him. The tears wouldn't stop. An hour passed, then 2. How could he be so tired and yet unable to sleep? At the 3rd hour, around 1 in the morning, he vaguely registered a catatonic instinct to crawl out of bed. Dressed in nothing but an old baggy shirt that used to fit him at some point, ironically reading, "I survived my trip to NYC," and some sweatpants that had a small tear in the right knee. Peter limped out of his apartment, barely blinking and completely lost in a daze. His thoughts were turning into a dark direction again, and he never liked having them in his apartment. They were better off somewhere else. The rooftop was layered in half an inch of snow, glittering slightly like fairy lights against the yellow glows of the buildings that surrounded his apartment building. Tiny little snowflakes continued to gravitate onto the peaks of the buildings, drifting against the bitter cold wind and settling into every nook and crevice that each one could find. The snow was numb against his bare feet, the cold chill seeping into his skin and bones. It only seemed to worsen the misery he carried. Peter only had a vague reason in his head as to why he was up here, undisclosed even to him. One that he couldn't put into words that would have any reasoning behind them. One that would surely put a stone on his tongue if he ever tried to say it aloud. Actions spoke louder than words, though, and he found his toes curling on the very edge of the rooftop. Peter let out a breath, watching the fog escaping his mouth curl and wisp and vanish into nothing. It was freezing. His body was already numb, but it was a repeat from earlier that night. The pain was proof that he existed in the here and now. He leaned forward dangerously, swaying, and then leaned back again. He exists. I exist. I exist. I exist. There were sticky notes on his wall. Was that proof enough? I exist. He had a present. No future yet, just a present. Just a bottomless now that forced him to keep dragging himself towards a maybe future that only consisted of stupid sticky notes stuck to a wall that was full of unfulfilled desires of what he wanted to be. There was no could be or will be, just a want to be. Dare say a need. He needed to be the sticky notes on his wall. In the past, everything that he owned now was just evidence that he existed before all of this. Even if nobody's memories contained it, even if the records didn't show it, he once existed in people's hearts, in people's minds, and in people's hearts. He existed in Aunt May's heart, in Tony Stark's heart, in Uncle Ben's heart, in Happy's heart, in Ned's heart, in MJ's heart. I exist, I exist, I exist. His clothes were evidence of Aunt May's care. The remains of old Spiderman suits of Tony Stark's intellect. The Lego pieces strayed across his room, evidence of Ned's friendship. The grieving wound in his soul, evidence of MJ's love. His apartment was an evidence locker, a now yearning for a future. His future was only sticky notes. And if that was all it was, maybe it wouldn't be so bad to cut his future short. He could do it. He could let go. He had jumped off so many buildings before, so why couldn't he do it now? Peter stepped back away from the edge, as though he had been stung, turned away and hobbled towards the fire exit that led back into the apartment, and then collapsed onto his knees before he could even get halfway to the door. His elbows caught his fall, the thin sheet of snow and frost stinging at his bare skin. Peter stared blankly at the ground, eyes wide and beginning to swim with tears. Peter's body quivered and trembled. It wasn't the cold that was bothering him. He could hardly even feel the chill. But instead he shuddered at the vast emotions that were overwhelming and strangling him, burning imprints into his body and his soul. A vague noise started to grow, barely a whimper at that moment. It ate at his heart, at his chest, clawing its way up his throat. What came out was laughter. He laughed as tears began to swim down his face, and then he released a mirthless howl that almost seemed like a raw and deriding scream, inhaling a sharp breath that practically rattled his insides. Peter finally broke down into sobs. They heaved at his chest, battering against his ribcage, and ached at his lungs. Peter's throat burned as he gasped and inhaled the cold night's air. "Nothing's changed!" he wailed out into solitude. I'm still all on my own! I haven't changed one bit! I'm still as useless as I've ever been!" His throat scratched and smoldered. He could hardly breathe, scarcely able to inhale any of the air that the unwelcoming night offered. He was suffocating. Peter was suffocating. He drew in a long breath. "Nothing's changed!" he howled, and he finally released a scream of absolute raw emotional agony. All the rage and fury, the grief and misery, everything that had ever built up in the last few weeks of complete loneliness and depression spilled out into an agonizing scream that echoed and reverberated across the rooftops and buildings across the starscape structures dotted around Manhattan. Nobody would hear his cry. He was, irrevocably, alone. Peter rolled over into the snow, his body convulsing and twitching as he struggled to stabilize his breathing. He tightened his eyes and curled in on himself, retching and inhaling unwanted gasps for air. Then something crawled up his spine. It was his tingle, his spider sense. Something was wrong, surely, and yet it didn't cry out a warning of danger. It was an oddly familiar experience, but he couldn't quite put a finger on it. Peter rolled over again onto his back, almost spread-eagled, and let out another gasp, this time filled with shock. Someone was crouched directly above him on the roof of the fire exit that led back inside the building. They were perched right on the edge, leaning almost impossibly forward, their hands placed right in front of them and their knees pointing opposite directions. They had a red and blue spandex costume on, so eerily familiar, and a pair of large, bug-eyed white eyes gazed back down at Peter's own bloodshot brown. Oh ho ho ho! But it couldn't be. Another Spider-Man? Peter tried and failed to scramble to his feet, still overcome with the burden of emotional whiplash that all energy had been sapped from him, but alarming the other Spider-Man, who quickly stood up and raised his hands into the air as though to pacify Peter. Crawling backward in a flurry of panic, Peter felt the back of his wrists hit the edge of the rooftop and the frost numb into his skin. "Hey, careful," the other Spider-Man said. "Don't want to fall now, do we?" Who are you?" Peter spluttered, his unruly trembling worse than ever before. I'm Spider-Man?" the stranger replied, as if distastefully pointing out the obvious. You all right? You seem, well, I heard crying?" "No," Peter replied, then shook his head. "No, as in, no, I mean, but you're..." A sunrise of realization was dawning upon him. This wasn't just some Spider-Man cosplayer. He had seen this costume before. But this was even more impossible. How? "You're Spider-Man," Peter gasped. "Yeah, I thought we covered that bit," the other Spider-Man replied, tilting his head in confusion. No, you're..." Peter finally scrambled to his feet, rapidly brushing down his frost-stained t-shirt and sweatpants and gazing up with a mixture of shock and awe. "You're Peter Parker, and I'm... Don't you recognize me? He swallowed hard, his clenched fist shaking. You're Peter 3! The word seemed to strike something akin to recognition into the other Spider-Man. He hesitated, then hopped off the roof and pulled off his mask. Peter was met with the face he so clearly remembered, even after all these months. Appearing remarkably young for his age, fluffy brown hair that always seemed to stick upwards and outwards, soft brown eyes that complemented Peter's own. Peter Parker 3's expression was slowly turning into shock and recognition. Then his jaw swung open, and he pointed back at Peter as joy flooded through every portion of his body, splitting into a broad and elated grin. But you're... Peter, buddy! Holy shit! Peter 3 bounded forward, seizing the younger Peter by the torso and embracing him into what was evidently the biggest, warmest hug he could muster. Peter 3 was laughing like a maniac, almost lifting his younger counterpart a few inches off the ground, and Peter beamed back. His preceding episode of tearfulness forgotten, and now replaced with a huge grin, a baffled, joyous, almost heartbreaking kind of grin. It felt like so much time had passed since he had even genuinely smiled like this. The laughter brought something familiar yet intimate into him. A golden ray of hope, small yet sublime, a feeling he had pushed down for so long as he expected nothing but disappointment. But this was real! Someone knew him! And it was someone he had yearned to see for so long. His misery clung onto him, omnipresent as ever, but it was slowly being washed away by a river of solace and happiness that he had previously been afraid to face. Someone knew him. He really did exist. Peter 3 finally let him back down onto the ground and shifted back slightly, but his hands were still placed on top of Peter's shoulders to maintain their joyous connection formed from their reunion. He had a huge grin plastered on his face, a spark of delight glimmering in his impossibly warm and comforting mirror-brown eyes. "Holy shit, I can't believe it! How... you..." Peter 3 seemed at loss for words and kept shaking the younger Peter, floored by the bizarre position of circumstances they had been unexpectedly placed into. You shouldn't... How are you here?" "That's just what I'm wondering," Peter protested indignantly. Now that the sweeping flow of joy had passed, it was replaced with a growing gnawing sensation of perplexity and dread. If his interdimensional counterpart was here, surely that meant worse than just bad news. You shouldn't be here." "I shouldn't be here? You shouldn't be here!" Peter 3 retorted, equally perplexed, but seemingly absent of the same apprehension. Wait, whose universe are we in?" "Mine!" Peter replied instantly, then felt a seed of doubt drop in his chest. He spun around, gazing around the snow-speckled rooftop anxiously. Everything seemed to be in place, and exactly the same. Yet there was no visual indicator that he could even be in the same space as he was beforehand. "Actually, I don't know. It really could be anyone's. How..." He pivoted back around. Peter 3 was pacing up and down now, occasionally turning and offensively gesturing to the younger Peter as if this was all his fault somehow. "How did you get here, though?" "Why? What's special about here?" This is my apartment building." "Is it?" Peter 3 stopped, staring suspiciously. "You live in Midtown?" "Yeah, what's wrong with..." Peter growled under his breath and shook his head. "No, getting off track. How did you..." "I heard screaming," Peter 3 replied simply, with a little grimace and a shrug. "I was on patrol, and I heard screaming. And then..." He paused for a moment, a fleeting glimpse of bewilderment flickering across his expression. "Then I got hurt. Like, I felt pain all across my body. It's like... You ever get really, really bad pins and needles to the point where it actually hurts and you can't even move your muscle, else your limbs might just fall off? Wait, why are you looking at me like that?" Peter's expression had flitted from bewilderment into disturbed comprehension. He knew that feeling exactly. The sudden pain all throughout the body, a tingling discomfort that came as quickly as it went. And then, proceeding straight afterwards, his environment would look a little bit different than what he was adjusted to. But then, that would explain the Avengers Tower disappearing. There was no Avengers Tower in their universe. Were the two of them dimension hopping? But how could he be doing that? How could both of them be doing that? "Hello, Earth to discount Peter Parker!" Peter blinked at Peter 3's concerned call, then his brow furrowed. "Discount?" Whoops. "Well, yeah, you're smaller and tiny, so you're the discount." Peter 3 shrugged, but there was a glint of humor twinkling in his eye. "Did you relate too hard to my metaphor? I was saying I felt a bit of pain and stopped off on a building to catch my breath. Definitely didn't fall flat on my face. And then I heard, screaming. Or yelling. Screaming. It wasn't like someone was in pain. Like they were, I don't know, sad. So I hopped over, and then I found you lying out here in the snow. Was that you? Were you screaming?" Peter's bottom lip trembled for a moment, and he averted his gaze. The sadness was creeping back up to him, clawing his way up to his up his bones and his body. He didn't want Peter 3 to know the truth. To Peter 3, however, the answer was pretty obvious, but he didn't want to accuse. He wanted to allow the younger Peter Parker the opportunity to deny it. But it was so obvious. The tear-stained cheeks and bloodshot eyes, bruised and scabbed knuckles, shadows under the eyes, and clothes that were much too big for his skinny stature. Peter 3 knew misery and hard times firsthand. He knew what it looked like because it was like he was looking into a mirror, and it looked like the young Peter Parker standing before him. "You gotta be freezing," Peter 3 said, finally breaking the awkward silence. Scooping an arm around the back of Peter's neck, he pulled the younger man into the side of his chest, into a juxtaposing embrace of both physical discomfort and emotional consolation. "How about we go into your apartment, huh? Assuming that it will be your apartment, of course, and we hopefully won't barge into some random stranger's apartment in my universe." He turned and carefully escorted the young Peter to the fire exit. "That is not something I want to deal with right now." They were fortunate enough to find that they absolutely were in Peter 1's universe, since his apartment was the same as he had left it. Confined to it for several weeks in a very poor mood, Peter had not bothered tidying up after himself, on the assumption that he was not going to have guests over. The bed covers were knotted and thrown about, half of it drooping from the bed. The compact, rickety kitchen table on the left of the apartment close to the door was filled with flasks and bottles where he could craft his web fluid. His desk, crammed unceremoniously in the gap between the two windows, was overflowing with notebooks, textbooks, and discarded pencils. The sofa that sat opposite his bed contained the remains of unwashed shirts and stray Lego pieces. "Sorry about the mess," Peter muttered quietly, kicking an unopened letter on the floor out of sight. "I've seen worse out of my own bedroom, don't worry," Peter 3 replied. The older Peter Parker slowly explored the room, gazing around at the obviously second-hand furniture and unsuccessful repair attempts, with an expression of both self-induced amusement and empathy. "Wow, I mean, this brings back memories, dude." Snapping the door shut, Peter glanced up with a look of puzzlement. "I mean, it reminds me of my first apartment," Peter 3 quickly reiterated. "The creaky bed, the cramped space, crap thrown all over the place. Still, a working radiator in Midtown. You did pretty decent for a first-time renter in high school." Yeah," Peter said with a humorless half-grin and avoided eye contact. He wasn't sure how Peter 3 was going to react when he explained he had dropped out of high school, and didn't really feel like bringing it up right now. Peter 3's attention finally caught what was obviously the apartment's shabby showpiece. Above Peter's bed was the mass of sticky notes, randomly assorted in pale and pastel colors, each with scribbled writing of varying amounts, and pieces of frayed string connecting a few of them together. An onslaught of memories tumbled through Peter 3's mind. He had something like this, a very long time ago, when interconnecting newspaper clippings with red tape as he investigated the truth of his parents' recondite abandonment. Except this wasn't about their father. It was about Peter. Craning his neck, Peter 3 studied the various sticky notes slapped onto the wall with mild interest. "Bitten by radioactive spider at Science Expo. Got Tony Stark's autograph. I wonder where it went. I webbed Captain America and stole his shield. It was pretty badass. Don't forget the bad memories, too. You have counterparts from another universe. That's insane. Don't forget to pay rent, first of every month. Get coffee from Donut Shop, always takeout. Study hard. Look at applying to Empire State University. Don't be rageful. Be responsible." "Oh," a small voice came from the other side of the small room, and Peter 3 turned around. Peter, who had apparently been in the process of throwing some spare pillows and a blanket onto the sofa, was looking from the wall to Peter 3, looking almost embarrassed. I feel like there's a lot I gotta be caught up on," Peter 3 replied, trying to ease the young Peter's rising humiliation with a comforting smile. Hey, I'm not judging this. Whatever helps to ground you, man, I respect it." He quickly changed the topic. What are you doing?" "Oh," Peter said, now looking between the couch and Peter 3. "Well, you just got transported into a new universe again, and I don't really know how to get you home, so I thought, if you needed somewhere to crash." "Right, no, yeah," Peter 3 said, swerving over to ruffle Peter's hair. "Appreciate it, buddy. Are you alright? Do you want to sleep? It's pretty late. We can just..." "No, I'm alright," Peter insisted, sitting down on one end of the couch. "If you want to, get dressed..." "Yeah, I didn't realize I'd be having a sleepover. I kinda left my backpack behind in an alternate dimension." That brought a small smile to Peter's lips. "You can borrow my stuff. It might be a little snug. Or it might fit. I don't know. Some of my stuff is a size up. Just, grab stuff off the floor. Sorry, I'll tidy up, I promise." "I got questions," Peter 3 declared as he started rummaging around the various clothes straight around the room. "When I said I was in pain, your face kind of lit up a little. Was it just the pins and needle thing that hit home, or do you actually have some experience with very sudden agonizing pain? That's to say, abnormal agonizing pain, since the whole sudden pain is kind of part of the job." Peter nodded in response. "Experience. I've had those pains too. They weren't always that bad, but just tonight I had a bad episode like the one you had. And every time it happens, well, stuff kinda changes. Like a shop I know is on the corner is suddenly gone, or a building has a completely different coat of paint. But tonight, I saw that Avengers Tower, it's a big skyscraper right in Manhattan, literally can't miss it. It was just gone. And then suddenly it wasn't." "We don't have an Avengers Tower in our universe," Peter 3 mumbled, the gears grinding to the same conclusion Peter already had gotten to. "Exactly! And after you got that pain, you turned up here, in my universe. So, what if these pains are the effects of us dimension hopping? Before, it was using magic, but we're kinda just doing it." "There's a new achievement for my resume," Peter 3 quipped, wriggling into the most oversized shirt that he could find that had a faded Star Wars logo emblazoned on the front. "Won high school award for best self-made invention and innovation, runner-up in New York under-18 skateboarding competition, and irregular interdimensional traveler." "I'd hire you," Peter smirked in response, then lapsed back into seriousness. "But obviously there's gotta be a reason why this happened. 'Cause we fixed the universe. We saw it happen. You got sent back into your dimension. The spell worked, and now it seems like it's somehow breaking apart again." "Maybe the spell is broken," Peter 3 suggested somewhat lamely, now trying to fit into some tight sweatpants that refused to move anywhere past his upper thigh. "No," Peter replied, his tone confident but morose. "No, it's definitely not broken." "How would you know?" I just do." Peter 3 frowned. Peter's expression had darkened. He recognized that expression. The kid had worn it when they had met for the first time, contorted with a mix of grief and anger, penetrating deep enough that it only brought back recognition. Giving up on his fruitless attempts to squeeze into the pants, he collapsed onto the sofa beside Peter, dressed in nothing but a snug t-shirt and boxers, and stared at his younger counterpart for a moment, head tilting back and analyzing the young boy quietly, as though scrutinizing him. Peter forcefully kept Peter 3's arm at arm's length, abstaining from giving him a sign of acknowledgement. "You're not telling me things," Peter 3 started. "Is it that obvious?" Peter replied humorlessly, avoiding eye contact. "I just want to help, you know that," Peter 3 continued, ignoring the comment. "You know that! You know that out of anyone, I'm probably best equipped to help you. Except maybe the other Peter, since he's like some self-care advocating youth pastor, apparently." He paused, although whether to allow Peter a chance to speak up or to laugh, which he didn't, was unclear. "'Cause I've dropped into your universe and found you lying in the snow on the rooftop, crying your lungs out, I come into your apartment to see sticky notes trying to remind you of who you are. You're irrevocably confident that some wacko wizard's spell hasn't broken, and there's a GED textbook lying on your desk. Peter jolted with surprise, and his eyes flickered to the desk, where the textbook laid out with its front cover obviously reading GED Test Study Manual in large letterings on the front. Traitor, Peter hissed at the book. Talk to me, Peter 3 said, ignoring Peter's attempt to deflect the sincerity of the conversation. His voice was low and desperate, and he scooted a little closer towards Peter. I want to help. You're keeping all this close to your chest. I've seen what that can do to somebody. It'll eat you alive. Peter opened his mouth, swallowed hard, then closed it again. His hands wrestled against each other as he swirled his tongue in his mouth. Excuses coated his tongue like sugar. Then the truth that trembled in his throat nearly spilled out, but lead weighed down in his mouth, pressuring him to be unable to divulge. Peter 3 was just sat there in silence, patiently waiting for when Peter was ready. Finally, he swallowed hard, and Peter spoke, his voice shaking and uncertain. The reason you were brought to my universe the first time was 'cause I seriously screwed up. My identity got blown, and I ruined my friends' lives. We were gonna go to MIT. They got rejected because of me. A lot of people got hurt simply because they knew me. So I spoke to Steven, to the wizard, and he was gonna cast a spell to make the world forget that I was Spider-Man. But I screwed that up too. That's what brought you and all those bad guys here. When it came to fixing that for good on the Statue of Liberty, well, all the people trying to get into our universe, they weren't just coming for Spider-Man. They were coming for Peter Parker. He inhaled a shaky breath, his lungs quivering, and pressed on. So, I told Stephen to cast the spell again, except to make the world forget about Peter Parker. Peter heard a sharp intake of breath from his side, but he kept going. So that meant everyone forgot about me. Stephen, Ned, Happy, my teachers, and my classmates. Even MJ. Fuck, Peter 3 whispered. But Peter plowed on. If he stopped, he wasn't sure if he could keep going. I was on my own. I am on my own. I thought I could manage it. I really tried. It was so hard, though. I existed on public record, but it was hard to prove that it was me, 'cause nobody could remember me. But I got this apartment. I got a job. I kept being Spider-Man. Tears stung in the corners of his eyes. But I don't have Ned or MJ anymore. After May died, they were all I had, but I let them go. So they could be happy. They are happy. Next year, they're going to go to MIT, and they're going to have a great life. And I'll try to get my GED, and who knows, maybe I'll get into the local community college or something. Peter, but it's hard! His voice rose now, almost into a cry. You know, I try every day. I even had a stupid schedule for a few weeks, but I didn't follow it. I didn't. That was me on the roof screaming, alright? It was me. I was close to being just done. A lump grew in his throat. He had turned right at that moment to finally properly face Peter 3, and turned in shock at the expression on his his brother's face. It had flushed red in the cheeks, his deep brown eyes were watering, and a stray tear was going down his face. Peter's jaw wobbled as he tried to speak once again. I'm sorry, Peter 3 whispered. I'm sorry, Peter. God, I'm so sorry. Look, you know how much me and the other Pete have gone through, but you're still a kid, and you've gotten all this shit dumped on you. It's unfair, Peter mumbled. It's really unfair. Parker's theorem. Peter Parker can never, ever be happy, and it's unfair, but it's the unequivocal truth. Tears spilled over Peter's cheeks again. He tried to look away and rub them away from his cheeks, but found an arm hooking around his shoulder as Peter 3 dragged the young boy toward him. Peter planted his face into the side of his counterpart's chest, pressing his face against the warm body and the loose shirt as he silently began to cry again. A pair of arms lifted him up a little higher and wrapped across his entire body. Being hugged like this felt like he was coming home. "It's going to be hard," Peter 3 whispered into his ear. Peter had always viewed Peter 3 as the natural jokester, always ready for a quick joke and a grin, but his words of comfort came naturally. "And it's going to keep getting harder. I don't think it ever really stops for us, you know. But there's going to be good moments to look forward to. Moments we can stop and, be happy. And we gotta hold on to those moments, yeah? We hold it tight, and we don't let go." "I want my aunt back," Peter whined, feeling ashamedly childish. "I want Ned and MJ back. I want my life back." "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Pete. I don't know if anyone can give you that back. I wish I could. But we can rebuild, okay? We can rebuild it." Peter nodded and sniffled, then buried himself deeper into Peter 3. A warmth was blossoming over him. He felt like a great weight was slowly being wrenched off his shoulders. "Your hugs feel really familiar," Peter murmured. Peter 3 grinned. "Probably just our dimension counterpart thing." "No, your hugs remind me of Uncle Ben." Peter 3 trembled as his heart swelled and broke into pieces. Tears flooded into the corners of his eyes, and he found himself silently crying directly into Peter's curly brown hair. "The feels!" Peter only needed to spend a few hours with Peter 3 to realize the differences between them both. The similarities still stuck out, the traits persisting even to the currently absent Peter 2. They were all social outsiders in some manner, all three of them humble geniuses with a talent for science, chemistry, and engineering. The two present Peter Parkers enjoyed the same sci-fi films, both loved takeout pizza from a very specific local business, and shared a similar guilty, not-so-guilty pleasure of enjoying Coldplay albums. But the biggest difference was on how the world spat them both out as social outcasts. Peter was a nerd through and through. He was dorky and socially awkward, unashamedly a pop culture fanatic, and formerly a victim of relentless bullying due to his nervous and clumsy traits. Peter 3 was a nerd too, but Peter viewed him more as a minor delinquent. A little more likely to cause trouble, a bit more introverted, outcasted from social groups, and unable to fit anywhere, even among nerds like Peter. He also found it really cool that Peter 3 was an avid skateboarder, and wondered if he ought to pick up the hobby himself. When Peter 3 vanished for about 5 minutes, leaving Peter to pace around his room and resume his mental debate on how the hell this could have even occurred, and returned with a crate of alcohol and a mischievous grin, Peter felt as though he was hanging out with a cool kid. If he closed his eyes, he could reimagine and repaint the scene around him into something out of a cheesy coming-of-age. He wasn't the lonely, anguished Peter Parker hanging out with himself from another universe. He could be a 15-year-old teenager, skipping out on his least favorite lesson and hanging on the back steps of some abandoned building with his delinquent brother. It wasn't reality, though. By about 3 a.m, both Peter Parkers were drunk. Maybe it wasn't the best way to stave off sleep and combat misery, but Peter didn't really care much at the moment. Giggling at a joke Peter 3 told 5 minutes ago, he tilted his head to look up at his brother, who was sitting cross-legged on the ceiling like it was a natural thing to do. Okay, but seriously, humble brag, what's the coolest thing you did as Peter Parker with your powers? Peter 3 chuckled, his cheeks flushing pink. Think, you know, you just woke up that morning and you're suddenly really muscly and you don't need your stupid glasses anymore. As Peter Parker? Peter mumbled, his head slightly dizzy. I mean, like, I tried not to use my powers a lot, 'cause I knew, like, I couldn't do them before, so why should I now? Peter 3 paused, apparently absorbing this advice, then replied, I beat the school bully at basketball. Peter smirked. Was he, just by chance, named Eugene Thompson? And called himself Flash because he thought it was cool? Peter 3 nodded, grinning. This is so weird, dude. I can't believe there's a dimension counterpart to Flash frickin' Thompson. What happened with the basketball? I kept telling him to grab it, and he'd try to, but, like, he couldn't. And then I slam dunked the basketball into the hoop and smashed all the glass. Seriously? Yeah, got in trouble for it. I had a really hard time, like, trying to assimilate with my strength. When I got my powers, I mean. Like, I was breaking stuff all the frickin' time. It was the sensory stuff for me, Peter replied. Everything was just loud and bright. Hurt my head. He closed his eyes, swaying slightly as his head began to spin a little more. Extra worse with Flash being rowdy in my ear all the time. You know, me and Flash, we actually, like, made up. You did? Yeah, no, like, we kinda, after Uncle Ben died, I guess he sorta sympathized more. We weren't, like, friends or anything, but we were friendlier. Peter pouted. Flash tried to pretend to be my best friend when my identity was outed. He even wrote a stupid book. Sorry, my throat hurts. Peter 3 stood up from the ceiling, stretching out and flipped over to land neatly on the ground on 2 feet. Your Flash Thompson just sounds like a douche. He hopped onto the sofa and leaned back, stretching out his legs and settling in. Okay, so, like, interdimensional stuff. Yup. Something's probably breaking the multiverse. Again. Yeah. So, where do we start? Peter looked over to Peter 3, who was looking back at him intently. Biting his lip, Peter thought hard. Where would they start? His first thought was to approach Doctor Strange, but he could only imagine the very first image that came to his head when Peter first conceptualized returning to Stephen, being turfed out the sanctum and told never to come back. He wasn't sure if Stephen would be happy to meet Spider-Man, who seemed to keep breaking reality apart. Maybe it could be a backup plan. But there weren't any other leads. All they knew right now was that both of them seemed to have some subconscious subpower to jump between dimensions. Plural, Peter 3 corrected after Peter voiced this thought aloud. 1 dimension. We can go in between 1 dimension. I might have gone into another one that just looks exactly the same, Peter replied defensively. His head was starting to spin from a mixture of the strong alcohol content swirling in his system and the confused thoughts churning through his brain. Not to mention that he was emotionally exhausted from the sudden switch from absolute agonizing despair to hope and elation. Whoa, careful there, New York menace, Peter 3 said, raising up an instinctive protective hand. You just turned 3 shades greener than Dr. Connors. You okay? Peter blinked and absent-mindedly registered the fact that, at some point, he had just stood up. His stomach was currently disagreeing with the rest of his body's trajectory. Excuse me, Peter mumbled, stumbling across the apartment. I think I overestimated my high metabolism. I assumed you could hold your shit, I'm so sorry, Peter 3 joked with a lopsided grin. But his expression fell into one of sympathy as he heard retching noises echoing from the bathroom. Uh-oh, little baby webhead can't hold his shit. Peter 3 maneuvered into the bathroom and paused at the door, watching the younger Peter Parker kneeling over the toilet and releasing the contents of his stomach, which wasn't much, in truth. Tutting to himself, Peter 3 slowly moved toward Peter and started to rub slow circles on his back. Yeah, that's it. Let it out, Peter 3 smiled. Feels better when it's over, right? I'm never drinking again, Peter spat out in between gasps for air. Yeah, I heard that one before. Few of those times from me, actually. Let's get you to bed and we'll talk strategy in the morning, okay? Eyes blurred and stomach gurgling dangerously, Peter used Peter 3's support to clamber into bed and roll into the twisted blankets. Groaning as waves of nausea crawled over him, his eyes immediately began to flicker into slumber. Thanks, Peter, he mumbled. Any time, little bro. Peter paused and then smiled slightly. I love you, bro. Peter 3 paused for longer, feeling tears traitorously spring in the corners of his eyes for the second time tonight, and beamed, I love you too. Alright. It's too much fun using these, so I'm gonna doing that. Alright. Preview for next chapter. Oh! The belief that it is. He's dreaming, or maybe he isn't. Oh-ho. Alright, stay tuned. I will see you